London, 1723. A printer named James Anderson sits down to write the founding document of an organization that already presents itself through an ancient symbolic genealogy. He is not inventing something new. He is constructing a usable past for something that does not yet have a unified institutional history. And in doing so, he will accidentally create the most persistent mystery in modern Western history. That document, the Constitutions of the Freemasons, would connect a group of men who had recently been meeting in London taverns to a lineage stretching back to Adam, to Noah, to Solomon, to the great architects of the ancient world. None of it was verifiable. All of it was deliberate. And the story Anderson built that year would travel further, last longer, and generate more fear, more admiration, and more carefully recycled nonsense than almost any document produced in the 18th century. This is not a video about secret tunnels beneath Washington or bloodlines hidden from the Vatican. Those stories exist. They will be addressed honestly. But they are not the reason Freemasonry deserves 3 centuries of serious attention. The reason is simpler and stranger. Here is an organization with full archives, published rituals, verified membership lists, and documented meeting minutes going back to the early 1700s. It is one of the most extensively documented private organizations in Western history, and yet it remains, for a large portion of the public, more mysterious than civilizations that vanished without a written word. That gap between how much we actually know and how little most people believe we know is the real story. And it begins not with a conspiracy. It begins with a printer, a document, and a decision to make the present feel ancient. There are 2 ways to get Masonic history completely wrong, and both are extremely popular. The first version belongs to Freemasonry itself, particularly in the 19th century, when the fraternity was at its most culturally ambitious. In this version, Freemasonry stretches back to the builders of Solomon's Temple, or perhaps to the ancient mystery schools of Egypt, or at minimum, to the cathedral builders of medieval Europe. Every great man in history was probably a Mason. The symbols carry wisdom so deep that centuries of study have not exhausted them. The organization is ancient, noble, and has always stood for enlightenment and brotherhood. This version is occasionally beautiful. It is almost entirely without serious historical support. The second version belongs to the conspiracy tradition, which has been producing variations on the same theme since the 1790s. In this version, Freemasonry is the visible face of a hidden power structure that has controlled governments, engineered revolutions, and manipulated the course of Western history from behind closed lodge doors. The symbols do not carry wisdom. They carry instructions. Every suspicious coincidence in modern history traces back, if you look hard enough, to the same network of men in aprons exchanging secret handshakes. Both versions share something important. They are both, at their core, stories about hidden significance. One flattering, one sinister. Both require the same mental move, the assumption that what you can see and verify is less real than what lies beneath. This account takes a different position, not because the actual history is boring. It is not, but because the real history, read carefully and honestly, is more interesting than either version allows. Here is the thing about Masonic history that most accounts skip past too quickly. The organization has full archives. It has lodge records going back to the early 1700s. It has printed constitutions, membership registers, correspondence between officers, financial accounts, ritual texts, and minutes of meetings that document, in sometimes numbing bureaucratic detail, exactly what happened, in exactly which room, on exactly which date. Open a box of Masonic records from 1740, and you might find a list of members, the amount each paid in dues, who was absent, and whether the evening ended with a dinner. These are not the records of a hidden power. They are the records of a social club trying to keep track of who owed what. Historians who want to study Freemasonry are not working in a vacuum of evidence. They are working in a surplus of it. And yet the gap between what the archive contains and what the general public believes about Freemasonry is larger than for almost any comparable subject in modern Western history. That gap is not created by secrecy. It is created by two forces pulling in opposite directions, each distorting the evidence in its own preferred direction, each making the actual history harder to see. Consider the problem from the inside first. Every organization that writes its own origin story has an incentive to make that story impressive. The Freemasons had this incentive in an unusually pure form, because the legitimacy of the entire enterprise depended on the claim of antiquity. An organization founded by men meeting in London taverns in the early 1700s is a social club. An organization descended from the builders of Solomon's Temple is something else entirely. The distance between those two descriptions is the distance that Anderson's constitutions were designed to cross. Understanding that they were designed this way is not a criticism. It is the beginning of reading the evidence honestly. The conspiracy tradition has a different but equally serious problem. It operates on a logic that is genuinely difficult to falsify. When you believe that a powerful hidden organization is controlling events, any evidence that seems to contradict this belief can be reinterpreted as evidence of how effective the concealment is. No meeting minutes found. They were destroyed. No central command structure visible. That proves how sophisticated the network is. This is not analysis. It is a closed loop, dressed as research. And it has been running, in recognizable form, since 1797. The scholar David Stevenson, whose 1988 book, The Origins of Freemasonry, remains one of the foundational texts in the field, described the challenge this way. The fraternity has always attracted both uncritical admirers and uncritical detractors, and serious scholarship has had to fight for space between them. That fight is still ongoing. There is one more thing worth naming before this account goes any further. Freemasonry is not one thing. It never has been. A lodge in London in 1725, and a lodge in Charleston in 1850, and a lodge in Lagos in 1960 are all called Freemasonry. They share certain symbols, certain rituals, and a certain institutional genealogy. But the social function, the membership, the political meaning, and the cultural weight of the organization in each of those contexts are so different that treating them as a single, continuous entity distorts all three. The Freemasonry that helped shape the intellectual climate of the Enlightenment is not the same organization as the Freemasonry that refused to admit Black Americans for most of its history. The Freemasonry that Mussolini shut down by force is not the same as the Freemasonry that became, for many, a punchline about grown men in aprons. They share a name and a ritual structure. The rest requires context. Context. Specific. Historical. Un sentimental context. The kind that makes simple stories complicated and complicated stories true. The story of Freemasonry begins not with a great founding moment, but with a much more practical one. It begins with men who needed a credential system, then men who needed a social space, then men who needed a usable past, each group inheriting and transforming what the previous one had built. The question worth carrying through everything that follows is not whether Freemasonry has been a force for good or evil. Both are demonstrably true in different times and places. The real question is, what has this organization actually been? And what has it revealed about the societies it has moved through? The answers are not hidden. They are in the archive, in the lodge records, in the anti-Masonic pamphlets, in the Enlightenment correspondence, in the records of fascist suppression campaigns, and in the scholarship of historians who took the subject seriously enough to do the work. That work starts not in a lodge room with candles and aprons, but in the mud and stone dust of a medieval building site, where a group of men who traveled for work figured out how to prove to strangers that they knew what they were doing. Picture a building site in northern France. Sometime in the 12th century, not the finished cathedral you see in photographs, with its soaring vaults and colored light. The construction site, mud underfoot, timber scaffolding rising in unsteady sections, the smell of lime and wet stone, hundreds of workers moving through a landscape that will take generations to complete, most of them knowing they will never see it finished. Most of the men on that site are laborers. They dig, they carry, they mix. They are local, replaceable, and paid by the day. But a smaller group is different. These are the freestone masons, craftsmen skilled enough to work with the fine-grained limestone and sandstone that could be cut in any direction, shaped into the delicate tracery and load-bearing precision that the new Gothic architecture demanded. Their skill took years to acquire. It was not written down. It lived in their hands, their eyes, their judgment about how stone behaves under pressure. And here is the practical problem that would eventually, across several centuries, produce something that looks like the beginning of Freemasonry. These men traveled. The nature of large construction projects meant that when one phase of work was complete, the skilled masons moved on. They walked to the next project, sometimes hundreds of miles away, and when they arrived at a new site, they faced a question that had no easy answer in a world without professional credentials, without standardized licensing, without any institution that could vouch for a stranger's competence. How did you prove you knew what you were doing? The answer that developed, gradually and practically, was a system of recognition, signs, words, and grips that identified a man as having passed through a legitimate apprenticeship, not magic, not ritual in any spiritual sense. A functional credential system for a mobile workforce operating in a world that had not yet invented the paperwork to replace it. Think about what that moment looked like in practice. A man walks onto a building site in a city he has never visited. He knows no one. He has no papers. He makes a gesture, says a few words, receives a response, and the man in charge of hiring nods and points him toward the other skilled workers. That practical logic, recognition, trust, and admission into the craft would later be transformed into the elaborate ritual logic of Masonic initiation. In its original form, it was nothing more than a professional handshake in a world that had no other way to issue credentials. The documents that bring us closest to this world are the manuscripts known collectively as the Old Charges, and they require careful handling. The Regius poem, dated by most scholars to around 1390, is the earliest surviving example. It is a verse manuscript that lays out the history and moral obligations of the mason's craft, connecting the trade to figures like Euclid and to the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. The Cook manuscript, dated to roughly 1410, elaborates on this tradition with more detail about the legendary origins of geometry and the craft. Both documents are real. Both have been studied extensively. What they confirm is that by the late 14th and early 15th centuries, there existed a tradition of written regulations and legendary histories associated with the stonemasons' trade in England. What they do not confirm, and what needs to be said clearly, is an unbroken institutional line from these medieval guilds to the speculative Freemasonry that emerged in the early 18th century. What later Freemasonry preserved or transformed from earlier practices remains genuinely debated among scholars, and the gap between the last medieval Masons' lodge and the first modern Masonic lodge is real and should not be papered over with confident language. The most credible path of transmission has been traced through Scotland. David Stevenson's work identified lodge records from Edinburgh and other Scottish cities that survive in unusual detail. Records that are bureaucratic rather than ceremonial. Attendance lists, fee registers, membership rolls, kept because lodges needed to track who had paid their dues, not because anyone was trying to create an impressive origin story. What those records show is a transition in progress. Lodges that were once composed entirely of working craftsmen began to admit what the records call accepted Masons, men of education and social standing who had no professional need for the craft's secrets, but who were drawn to the lodge for reasons the records do not always make explicit. Scottish lodge records from around the early 1600s include entries noted with the same matter-of-fact tone used to record fee payments of local gentlemen, with no apparent connection to the building trade, being admitted as members. No explanation offered, no fanfare, just a name, a date, and the implied beginning of a transformation that would take another century to complete. Why would a gentleman in Edinburgh in the 1630s want to join a stonemason's lodge? The answers scholars have proposed are several, and not mutually exclusive. The lodges offered a space outside the normal social hierarchies of Scottish urban life. The craft's symbolic vocabulary, its talk of geometry and architecture as metaphors for moral order, appealed to men with a humanist education. And there is a specific intellectual context that matters here. The early 17th century in Northern Europe was a period of intense interest in the idea that geometry, numbers, and sacred architecture encoded deep truths about the structure of reality. The stonemason's craft, with its deep knowledge of proportion and construction, could be reimagined as something more than a trade. This does not mean Freemasonry descended directly from any single philosophical tradition. The evidence is not that clean. What it means is that the cultural conditions that made a stonemason's lodge attractive to educated non-masons were in place well before 17. The transition from operative to speculative, from a guild of craftsmen to an organization of gentlemen using the symbolism of the craft for other purposes, was already underway in Scotland before it became a London phenomenon. The medieval stonemason did not found Freemasonry, but he provided something the educated gentlemen of the early 18th century needed very badly: a ready-made symbolic vocabulary, a tradition of craft secrecy that could be borrowed and reimagined, and a set of practical organizational habits around lodge structure and initiation that could be adapted to entirely different social purposes. The cathedral builder's credential system became, across 3 centuries of slow transformation, the initiation ritual of the Enlightenment gentleman. That transformation is not a corruption of something pure. It is how institutions actually work. They get picked up by people who were not their original users, repurposed for needs the original users never imagined, and in the process become something new while insisting they are something ancient. The insistence on antiquity was already present in the Regius poem and the Cook manuscript, which traced the mason's craft back to biblical and classical origins that cannot be historically verified. When Anderson wrote his constitutions in 1723 and extended that lineage back to Adam, he was not inventing a new habit. He was continuing one that had been running for at least 300 years. Organizations that feel secure in their present do not typically reach backward for legitimacy. The repeated, anxious assertion of ancient origins in early Masonic documents is evidence not of genuine antiquity, but of genuine uncertainty about whether the present, on its own, was enough. It was not, so they built a past instead. On the 24th of June, 1717, 4 lodges in London met at the Goose and Gridiron Alehouse in St. Paul's Churchyard and agreed to form a Grand Lodge of England. They elected a Grand Master. They established, at least in principle, that this new body would have authority over lodges in the region. And then, as far as the historical record is concerned, they went home. That is roughly the extent of what we can say with confidence about the founding moment of modern Freemasonry. No detailed minutes from that meeting survive. The account we have comes primarily from later sources, most significantly from the second edition of Anderson's Constitutions published in 1738, written with the explicit purpose of establishing the Grand Lodge's historical legitimacy. Reading it as a neutral record of events is like reading a coronation speech as a neutral account of succession law. The document has an argument to make, and it makes it. The 4 lodges themselves are known to us largely by the taverns where they met. the Goose and Gridiron, the Crown Ale House in Parker's Lane, the Apple Tree Tavern in Covent Garden, the Rummer and Grapes in Channel Row. These were not temples. They were pubs. The men who gathered in them were not monks or scholars or guardians of ancient wisdom. They were, by the best evidence we have, a mix of craftsmen, tradesmen, professionals, and minor gentry who found each other's company agreeable and who had organized that company around a shared set of rituals and symbols borrowed from the stonemasons' tradition. Why did they decide, on that particular June evening, to formalize themselves into something larger? The honest answer is that we do not entirely know. Historians have proposed several explanations, none of them mutually exclusive. One is simply administrative. The lodges had been operating independently, and there were practical advantages to coordinating standards, settling disputes, and presenting a unified face to the world. Another is social. The early 18th century in London was a period of extraordinary associational energy, with hundreds of clubs, societies, and fraternities forming and dissolving constantly. And the Masonic lodges may have been trying to distinguish themselves by acquiring an institutional structure that more casual clubs lacked. A third explanation is specifically political. The post-Glorious Revolution settlement of 1688 had created a new kind of English civil society, one that needed new kinds of institutions for a new kind of citizenry. What is clear is that the founding moment produced almost immediately a problem that would define the organization for centuries. The new Grand Lodge needed to explain what it was, and the answer that Anderson provided in the Constitutions of 1723 was not primarily a description of the lodges as they existed. It was a construction of the lodges as they wished to be understood. The Constitutions are a remarkable document in the history of institutional self-invention. Anderson assembled from existing sources, from the old charges, from biblical history, from classical legend, a narrative that positioned the new Grand Lodge as the current expression of an unbroken tradition of enlightened building, stretching back to the beginning of human civilization. Adam was the first Freemason. Noah was a Freemason. Solomon was a Freemason. The Greek and Roman architects were Freemasons. The builders of the great medieval cathedrals were Freemasons. And now, naturally, the men meeting in London taverns were the inheritors of this entire tradition. None of this was invented from nothing. As the previous chapter established, the habit of connecting the craft to ancient and biblical authorities had been running in the old charges for centuries. What Anderson did was systematize it, elaborate it, and give it the authority of print and formal institutional endorsement. He did what historians of early modern Europe recognize as a standard practice of institutional legitimation, constructing an ancient genealogy to serve the needs of a present that cannot justify itself on its own terms alone. Dynasties did it. Universities did it. Guilds did it. The specific Masonic version is simply one of the most elaborate and most consequential examples of a very common move. The political context matters here and is often underappreciated. England in 1723 was a country still working out what it meant to have overthrown one king and imported another. The Jacobite threat, the possibility of a Stuart restoration, was still real. The first major Jacobite rising had occurred in 1715, only 2 years before the Grand Lodge's founding. In this context, an organization that presented itself as ancient, as transcending particular political controversies, as committed to a kind of civic brotherhood that owed allegiance to the constitutional order rather than to any dynastic claim, had real political utility. Anderson's constitutions are explicit about this. The section on behavior in the lodge states that Masons should not be involved in plots or conspiracies against the peace of the nation, and that they should be subject to the civil powers. This is not the language of a social club worried about its members misbehaving. It is the language of an organization carefully positioning itself in a politically charged environment, signaling loyalty to the existing order while claiming to stand above ordinary partisan politics. The Grand Lodge grew rapidly after 1717. By 1730, there were more than 100 lodges in England alone, with others established in France, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and across the British colonial world. The spread was not primarily driven by mystery or by the attraction of secret knowledge. It was driven by the same thing that drives the spread of any successful social institution. The organization offered something that enough people wanted, and that no competing institution was offering, in quite the same way. What it offered was a room where certain rules applied that did not apply outside. A room where a man's standing was determined by his rank within the fraternity rather than by his birth or his wealth outside it. Where conversation could range across topics in ways that were regulated but relatively free. Where the ritual created a shared experience that bound men together across social divisions that governed the rest of their lives. Anderson's constitutions famously declared that Masons should belong to that religion in which all men agree. Leaving aside particular opinions, this was not a profound theological statement. It was a practical solution to the problem of building an organization that could include Anglicans, Dissenters, Catholics, and men of no firm belief at all. In a country where those distinctions had recently been the basis of a constitutional crisis, the theological neutrality of the lodge was a technology for social cohesion, not a philosophical position. It worked so well, and spread so far so quickly, that by the 1730s the organization had outgrown the context that produced it. Lodges in Paris were doing something different from lodges in London, which were doing something different from lodges in Philadelphia. The symbolic framework Anderson had built, flexible, almost to the point of emptiness, turned out to be remarkably well suited to being filled with whatever the local culture most needed it to contain. The Apple Tree Tavern is gone now. The Grand Lodge of England still meets in a building in Covent Garden not far from where it once stood. The building is large, ornate, and open to tourists on certain days of the week. You can walk through the Grand Temple and read the plaques and look at the portraits. Nothing about it looks like the headquarters of a secret world government. It looks like what it is: an old institution, proud of its history, somewhat uncertain about its future, sitting on top of a past that is considerably more interesting than its official version admits, and considerably less dramatic than its enemies have always insisted. The real story is between those two versions. That is where this account is going. There is a question worth sitting with before this chapter goes anywhere near founding fathers or secret handshakes. Why did smart people join? Not credulous people, not people looking only for social advancement, though plenty of those joined too, but genuinely brilliant, deeply skeptical, rigorously rational people. The philosophers and mathematicians and political theorists who defined the intellectual life of 18th-century Europe, the men who spent their careers dismantling superstition, questioning authority, and demanding evidence for every claim. Why did those men, in remarkable numbers, find their way into lodge rooms and submit to initiation rituals and call each other brother? The answer begins not with the lodge itself, but with the world outside it. Europe in the early 1700s was a continent in the middle of a transformation it did not yet have words for. The old certainties were eroding faster than the institutions built on them could adapt. Newton had published his Principia in 1687 and turned the physical universe into something that operated by laws a human mind could grasp. Locke had published his Essay Concerning Human Understanding in 1689, and argued that all knowledge comes from experience rather than divine revelation. The implications of both were radiating outward through European intellectual life with the force of slow explosions. But there was a practical problem that neither Newton nor Locke had solved. Where do you have the conversation? This sounds like a trivial question. It is not. The intellectual ferment of the early 18th century was not primarily a matter of books. Though books were important, it was a matter of exchange, of argument, of minds working against each other in the specific way that conversation allows. and the spaces available for that kind of exchange were severely limited by the social structures that organized everything else. The university was controlled by the church and by tradition. The aristocratic salon was controlled by patronage and social rank. The coffeehouse was open to anyone who could pay, which was an improvement, but it offered no continuity, no privacy, no mechanism for building the kind of sustained intellectual relationship that serious work requires. The lodge solved several of these problems simultaneously. It was private without being exclusive in the aristocratic sense. Entry was by initiation rather than by birth. It was regular, meeting on a fixed schedule, which created the continuity that the coffeehouse lacked. It operated under explicit rules about civil discourse, and it was, in principle, religiously neutral, which meant that conversations did not have to navigate constantly around the doctrinal fault lines that made serious discussion so dangerous in other contexts. It also had one feature that is easy to underestimate from the perspective of the present. What happened inside was not reported outside. This created something that 18th-century intellectual life badly needed and rarely had: a space where ideas could be tested before they were published, where positions could be explored without immediate public consequences. For the philosophers of the French Enlightenment, this was not a minor convenience. It was a genuine protection. Publishing heterodox ideas in France in the 1700s carried real risks. Voltaire had been imprisoned in the Bastille twice before he was 30. Diderot would be imprisoned for his writing. The lodge, with its insistence on internal privacy, offered a space to develop ideas that the public world was not yet safe for. In April of 1778, in a lodge room in Paris, an 83-year-old man was helped to his seat and initiated into Freemasonry. The ceremony had to be shortened because he was visibly failing. Several weeks later, he was dead. But in the time between his initiation and his death, he appeared at the lodge, received the embraces of his brothers, and accepted what the ceremony gave him: formal membership in a community he had been circling for most of his adult life. His name was François-Marie Arouet. The world knew him as Voltaire. The lodge was called the Lodge of the Nine Sisters. It was not a typical lodge. It was a gathering of the Parisian intellectual elite, the kind of place where Benjamin Franklin felt entirely at home. Franklin had been an active Mason since his 20s in Philadelphia. He had walked those same lodge floors in Paris, attended those same evening meetings, argued and laughed and called men brothers who would have been strangers to him in any other room. Franklin's correspondence suggests he regarded lodge life as one of the genuinely valuable forms of association available to a man of his particular kind of mind and ambition, a view consistent with his sustained engagement with the fraternity across 4 decades on 2 continents. In Vienna, a decade after Voltaire's initiation, a young composer named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart joined Freemasonry in December of 1784. He was 28 years old and took to lodge life with what his letters describe as genuine enthusiasm. He composed music specifically for lodge ceremonies, and in 1791, the last year of his life, he completed the Magic Flute. Picture the premiere at the Theater auf der Wieden in Vienna on the 30th of September, 1791. Most of the audience sees an opera, but the men in that theater who attended lodge on Tuesday evenings recognized, in the trials by fire and water, in the final act, in the 3-part chords that open the overture, in the conflict between darkness and rational light at the heart of the drama, the specific symbolic vocabulary of their ritual. Mozart was not hiding these references. He was celebrating them in the most public medium available to him. The Enlightenment Lodge was not a uniform institution. What Freemasonry meant in Vienna in 1784 was not identical to what it meant in London in 1717 or Paris in 1750. The organization had already fragmented into dozens of competing jurisdictions with different ritual systems and different political orientations. In France, the lodge system had become extraordinarily elaborate, with dozens of additional degrees beyond the basic 3. In Scotland and England, the tendency was toward a more conservative interpretation of the original structure. But across these variations, a common thread runs. The lodge in the 18th century was reliably, consistently the place where the social barriers of the outside world were suspended just enough to allow a different kind of interaction. A merchant in a Paris lodge in 1760 could sit in the same room as a duke, address him by a fraternal title rather than by an aristocratic one, and participate in the same ritual on the same terms. This did not make them equal in any sense that mattered when they left the building, but it created a social experience that had no parallel elsewhere in their world. The historian Margaret Jacob, whose work Living the Enlightenment published in 1991 is among the most important scholarly studies of this period, argued that the lodge functioned as a kind of rehearsal space for constitutional governance. Men who had never experienced anything like democratic procedure in the outside world learned inside the lodge to elect officers, debate motions, follow procedural rules, and accept majority decisions. This argument has been debated and qualified by subsequent scholars, and it is worth holding with appropriate care. The lodge was more politically diverse than any simple narrative suggests, and the relationship between Masonic sociability and broader political change was a matter of shared intellectual environment more than direct cause. But the core observation holds. The lodge did something to the men who participated in it that the rest of their social world did not do. By the time the 18th century ended, Freemasonry had spread to every corner of the Western world and to much of the colonial world beyond it. The organization that Voltaire joined in his last weeks had already, in other hands, become the organization that Catholic popes were condemning and that conspiracy theorists were imagining as the hidden government of the world. Both of those responses, the condemnation and the paranoia, were in their different ways tributes to something real. The lodge had mattered. It had done something in the world. The disagreement was only about what exactly that something was. Here is the paradox that sits at the center of every conversation about Masonic secrecy. The rituals are not secret. They have not been secret in any meaningful sense since at least the early 18th century. William Preston's Illustrations of Masonry, first published in 1772, laid out the structure and content of Masonic ritual in substantial detail for any reader who cared to find a copy. Similar exposures had appeared in France and the Netherlands even earlier. By the time William Morgan in Batavia, New York announced in 1826 that he intended to publish his own full account of Masonic ceremonies, he was not threatening to reveal information that had been successfully concealed for a century. He was threatening to produce one more entry in a genre that already had dozens of competitors. The scandal that followed Morgan's disappearance was not primarily about the exposure of secret information. It was about something else entirely. That story comes later. The immediate question is simpler. What actually happens in a lodge room? The physical space is worth describing first, because it is designed to do specific things to the people inside it. A traditional lodge room is rectangular, oriented east to west, in the same way a Christian church is oriented, with the principal officer of the lodge, the worshipful master, seated in the east. The room is decorated with specific symbols, the square and compasses, the level, the plumb rule, the rough and perfect ashlar, which are unworked and worked stones used as symbols of moral development, columns associated with two pillars from the Temple of Solomon. The floor is typically laid in a black and white checkered pattern. The ceiling, in many traditional lodges, is painted or decorated to represent the night sky. All of this is deliberate. The lodge room is an environment engineered to produce a particular state of mind in the people who enter it regularly. The basic structure of Masonic ritual is organized into 3 degrees. And understanding what each degree involves is straightforward, because the texts have been published and the structure is well documented. The first degree, entered apprentice, is the initiation proper. The candidate, who has been vouched for by existing members and approved by ballot, is brought into the lodge in a specific state, with certain items of clothing arranged in ways that create a deliberate vulnerability. Blindfolded and guided by an escort, the blindfold creates a physical experience of dependence and trust before the candidate has earned the right to see what he is entering. He is led through the lodge, challenged at symbolic points, and asked to make commitments before he is allowed to see the room he is in. The ceremony involves a formal commitment to the principles of the fraternity and to the keeping of its private proceedings, administered on a volume of sacred law. For most Western lodges, this is the Bible, but many jurisdictions explicitly permit other texts to be substituted according to the candidate's own faith. The obligation is followed by the communication of the signs, words, and grips of the degree, the means of recognition that descend, in their functional logic, if not their specific content, from the credential system of the medieval stonemason. The second degree, fellow craft, deepens the symbolism and introduces more elaborate material about the liberal arts and sciences and about the symbolic meaning of the temple's architecture. It is a middle stage. The candidate has been initiated but has not yet completed the journey the ritual describes. The third degree, Master Mason, centers on the story of Hiram Abiff, which will be examined in detail in the next chapter. In this degree, the candidate enacts a symbolic death and is symbolically raised. He is asked to reflect on mortality, on the question of what a man will and will not surrender under extreme pressure, and on the relationship between faithfulness to a commitment and the cost that faithfulness can demand. This is not a theological proposition. The lodge does not tell the candidate what to believe about death or the afterlife. It gives him an experience of confronting those questions in a structured, communal, ritualized setting. This helps explain something that puzzles many people: why rigorously rational men found ritual compelling. Ritual does not make factual claims. It creates experiences, and the experience of confronting mortality, of making a commitment in a formal setting before witnesses, of being welcomed into a community through a ceremony that marks the transition as real and significant. These are things that rational inquiry alone cannot provide. The lodge worked on its members in ways that a lecture about brotherly love could not. It made them feel, in their bodies and their memories, that they were part of something that mattered. Here is the thing that no exposé has ever actually exposed. The information content of the ritual is not secret. The experience of going through it in the proper context cannot be transferred by description. A man who has read every published account of Masonic ceremony and a man who has been through the ceremony are in possession of the same information. They are not in possession of the same thing. What the lodge keeps private is not what happens. It is what it means to have been there. And that distinction between information and experience is where the actual privacy lives. It is late at night, somewhere in England. Sometime in the early 1700s, a candidate stands in a lodge room he has visited before. But tonight is different. Tonight is the third degree. The officers are arranged in positions he has not seen before. The room is quieter than usual, more deliberate. The ceremony begins. He learns that he is to take the role of Hiram Abiff, the master builder of Solomon's temple. He learns that 3 ruffians sought from Hiram a secret he was not permitted to give. He learns that when Hiram refused, the first struck him, then the second, then the third, and then, in the ceremony, the candidate is struck, symbolically, in the ritual context, and he falls. He is laid on the floor of the lodge room. A cloth is placed over him. He lies there while the ceremony continues around him. And at some point in the stillness, the question that the third degree is designed to ask makes itself felt not as a proposition, but as an experience. What would you give up? And what would you refuse to give up if it cost you everything? And then he is raised. That scene has been taking place, in some form, in lodge rooms across the Western world since the early 18th century. It is the heart of Freemasonry. Everything else, the symbols, the degrees, the historical debates, the conspiracy theories, orbits around that moment. To understand what it is, you have to start with a passage from the Bible that is considerably less dramatic than what it inspired. There is a passage in the first book of Kings that describes a craftsman sent by the king of Tyre to assist Solomon in building his temple. The man is called Hiram, and he is described as filled with wisdom and understanding and skill for making any work in bronze. He cast the two great pillars that stand at the entrance of the temple. He does his work. The temple is completed. And then the text moves on. That is all the Bible says. No drama, no death, no secret withheld under torture. Just a skilled man doing skilled work. His name mentioned briefly in a list of construction details. And then silence. The figure who stands at the center of the Master Mason degree, the martyr architect Hiram Abiff, who dies rather than surrender the Master's word, is not that man. He shares a name and a general professional identity. Everything else. The murder, the three ruffians, the search for the body, the symbolic raising, is a construction that appears in Masonic ritual clearly and consistently by the early 18th century. What scholars call the Hiramic legend appears to have crystallized into something like its current form in the first decades of the 18th century, around the same period that the Grand Lodge of England was being established. Its specific origins before that point remain one of the genuinely open questions in Masonic scholarship. This is not a criticism of the legend. It is a clarification of what kind of thing it is. The Hiramic legend is not a historical account. It is a myth in the precise sense, a narrative that encodes values, that structures ritual experience, and that gives a community a shared story about what they stand for and what they are willing to sacrifice to stand for it. Myths of this kind do not need to be historically true to be culturally powerful. They need to be narratively compelling and symbolically resonant. The Hiramic legend is both. At the most immediate level, the legend is about professional integrity. Hiram dies because he will not give up something that is not his to give. The Master's word belongs to the full council of masters, and he alone cannot surrender it without violating a trust placed in him collectively. This is a story about the ethics of custody. Some things are held in trust, not owned, and the proper response to pressure to surrender them is refusal, regardless of personal cost. At a second level, the legend is about mortality and what it means to face it. The candidate goes through a symbolic death. He is laid on the floor. He is raised. The experience is designed to make the question of what a man will sacrifice feel real rather than abstract. At a third level, the story is about the relationship between knowledge and power. The ruffians want the secret because they believe it will give them something they have not earned. Hiram's refusal is a statement that certain kinds of knowledge cannot be taken by force. In a world where the authority of institutions was increasingly being questioned, this was a myth that spoke directly to anxieties about what legitimate authority looked like and where it came from. The question of where the legend itself came from has occupied Masonic scholars for 3 centuries. The most credible scholarly position, represented in the work of historians including David Stevenson and John Hamill, is that the Hiramic legend in its Masonic form developed gradually in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, drawing on a range of sources that included biblical commentary, medieval guild traditions, and the broader culture of early modern learned speculation about the secrets of the ancient world. Some scholars have noted structural similarities between the Hiramic legend and earlier ritual traditions, including certain passages in Rosicrucian literature from the early 17th century. These similarities are real. What remains genuinely contested in the scholarly literature is whether they represent direct influence, parallel development from shared cultural sources, or retrospective pattern matching. A definitive causal link has not been established to the satisfaction of the broader scholarly community, and claims to the contrary in either direction should be held carefully. What is not contested is the cultural power the legend acquired once it was in place. The third-degree ritual became the defining experience of Masonic membership in the 18th century and has remained so. Every subsequent elaboration of the Masonic system, every additional degree in the higher degree systems that developed through the 18th and 19th centuries, is in some sense a commentary on or extension of the Hiramic story. Organizations that endure, that create genuine loyalty and genuine identity, tend to have at their center not a triumphant founding, but a founding cost. The story is not about how the craft was built. It is about how it was preserved at cost. Membership in such an organization means membership in a community of people committed to maintaining something that someone died to protect. The fact that Hiram Abiff is not a historical figure does not diminish this function. A mythological martyr can be whatever the tradition needs him to be, can speak to whatever version of integrity and sacrifice the current generation of members finds most meaningful. The legend endures because the questions it raises do not go away. What will you refuse to surrender under pressure? What does it mean to face the fact of your own death in the company of men who have done the same? These are not Masonic questions. They are human ones. The Lodge did not invent them. It built a room for them, a ritual to approach them, and a community of men who had all gone through the same ceremony of confronting them. That room has been meeting for 300 years, and the legend at the center of it, the story of a man who died rather than surrender something he had sworn to protect, continues to provide what myths are supposed to provide. Not an answer. A shape for the question. On the 28th of April, 1738, Pope Clement XII signed a document that would shape the relationship between two of the most durable institutions in Western history for generations to come. The document was a papal bull, the most authoritative form of papal communication, known by its opening Latin words as in eminenti, a phrase that places the speaker in a position of elevated authority. It prohibited all Catholics from joining Masonic lodges, from promoting them, from providing any assistance or support. It threatened excommunication for those who disobeyed, and it instructed inquisitors and bishops to proceed against violators as persons under strong suspicion of heresy. The question worth sitting with, before examining what the Church objected to, is the question of proportion. Clement XII was the leader of an institution that had governed the spiritual lives of hundreds of millions of people for more than 1,000 years. He had at his disposal the most sophisticated administrative apparatus in the Western world. He was dealing, at the time he signed this document, with the continued threat of the Ottoman Empire, with the political instability of the Italian peninsula, with the ongoing challenge of Protestant states to the north, and with the internal theological disputes that never fully ceased in a church as large and complex as Rome. And he chose to issue his most formal category of document against a fraternal organization that had been formally in existence for less than 25 years. Why? The answer that anti-Masonic tradition has always preferred is that the Church understood what Freemasonry really was, a conspiracy against Christian civilization. This interpretation has the virtue of making the reaction seem proportionate, but the evidence for it in 1738 is essentially non-existent. The Freemasonry that Clement was condemning was not yet the organization associated with Enlightenment philosophy or revolutionary politics. It was still primarily a social fraternity of gentlemen meeting in taverns and lodge rooms. What Clement was actually responding to was something at once more mundane and more structurally significant than a conspiracy. He was responding to a model. The lodge was a model for organizing human association that had 3 specific features, each of which posed a genuine institutional challenge to the Church, and none of which required any malicious intent on the part of the lodges themselves. The first feature was jurisdictional independence. A Masonic lodge operated under the authority of its Grand Lodge, which operated under its own rules and its own system of legitimacy. A Catholic who joined a lodge was placing himself under an authority structure that was not the Church and that owed the Church nothing. What made the lodge different from ordinary secular authority was that it organized not just civil or professional life, but the inner life. The life of values, commitments, ritual, and community. These were precisely the areas the Church claimed as its own proper domain. A lodge that offered brotherhood, moral development, ritual experience, and a shared symbolic universe was not just competing with the pub, it was competing with the parish. The second feature was deliberate theological neutrality. The papal bull itself identifies this as one of the primary objections, that men of different religions meet together under the same roof and treat their religious differences as irrelevant to the purposes of the lodge. An organization that seated a Catholic next to a Protestant next to a Jew and asked all three to call each other brother was, in the Church's reading, implicitly endorsing a form of religious indifferentism that Catholic doctrine explicitly rejected. The third feature was secrecy. Why? The document asks, would upright men meet in secret? The Church was making a more fundamental argument, that institutions which operate outside the view of legitimate ecclesiastical authority are by definition not accountable to it, and that unaccountable institutions are dangerous regardless of their stated intentions. This argument has a logic that should not be dismissed simply because it comes from an institution with obvious self-interested reasons for making it. The point about accountability is a real one, and the Morgan affair, which this account will reach in a later chapter, provides a particularly clear demonstration of exactly this point. It is important to note here that the Church's response to Freemasonry was not uniform across Europe or consistent across time. In some Catholic countries and during certain periods, the papal prohibition was enforced with considerable energy. In others, including parts of Austria and Bavaria in the mid-18th century, Freemasonry operated with relative tolerance despite the official ban, reflecting the degree to which local ecclesiastical authorities exercised their own judgment about enforcement. The conflict between the Church and the lodge was real and consequential, but it was not a single monolithic opposition applied identically in every context. It was a complex, shifting relationship that played out differently according to local political conditions, the personalities of specific bishops and rulers, and the particular moment in the longer story. What followed in eminenti across the 18th and 19th centuries was a conflict that played out not primarily in theological debate, but in political history, and on a scale that neither Clement nor the London Lodge founders could have anticipated. In France, the relationship between Freemasonry and the Revolution of 1789 has been debated since Berulle published his conspiracy theory in 1797, and a careful account of that debate will be reserved for the chapter on conspiracy theory. What can be said here is that the French lodge system of the 1780s was one of the primary social spaces in which aristocrats, bourgeois professionals, and intellectuals mixed and developed the political ideas that would later appear in revolutionary documents. The lodge did not cause the revolution, but it was part of the social infrastructure within which the revolution became thinkable. In Italy, the relationship between Freemasonry and the Risorgimento, the movement for Italian national unification in the mid-19th century, is documented and direct. Consider Giuseppe Garibaldi, who commanded the red-shirted volunteers that swept through the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in 1860 and handed the south of Italy to the new unified state. He was a Freemason, and he served as Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Italy, the country's principal Masonic governing body. When his forces entered Naples to cheering crowds, the Masonic networks he had cultivated across decades of revolutionary activity were part of the organizational fabric of that movement. The Piedmontese liberals who drove the political process of unification operated in a world where lodge membership and reformist politics were closely intertwined. The unified Italian state that emerged was explicitly secular. and its relationship with the papacy was openly hostile for decades. For Pope Pius IX, who reigned from 1846 to 1878, and who watched Italian unification strip the Church of the Papal States that had been its territorial base for 1,000 years. Freemasonry was not an abstract theological concern. It was the organizational face of the forces that had just taken his land. These cases are not proof of a Masonic conspiracy to destroy the Catholic Church. They are evidence of something more structural, that in societies where the Church was the primary conservative institution, Freemasonry often became associated with the forces challenging that conservatism. Not because Freemasonry was inherently revolutionary, but because the lodge was the social space available to men who wanted to organize across the lines that the Church drew. The Church's official opposition to Freemasonry persisted in formal terms well into the modern era. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, under Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI, issued a declaration in 1983, reaffirming that membership in Masonic associations remains forbidden for Catholics, and that Catholics who join them may not receive Holy Communion. This document was issued in the same year that the world's Catholic population had grown to nearly 1 billion people. The Church still found it necessary to address Freemasonry specifically and formally. The persistence of the conflict tells you something that the content of the conflict alone does not. Two institutions, each convinced of its own primacy in the organization of human spiritual and social life, had been circling each other for 2.5 centuries. Neither had destroyed the other. Neither had fully resolved the challenge the other posed. The conflict was never primarily about secret knowledge or hidden power or the overthrow of civilization. It was about something more ordinary and more consequential. Two different answers to the question of where human beings should look for the values that organize their lives together, and who should be in charge of providing them. That question has not been resolved. It is simply less likely, in most of the Western world today, to result in a papal bull. On the 14th of December, 1799, George Washington died at his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia. He was 67 years old. The funeral arrangements that followed included something that has been noted in every account of his death written since. Washington was buried with Masonic honors. The men who carried his coffin wore Masonic regalia. A Masonic ceremony was performed at the grave. The lodge he had been affiliated with, Alexandria Lodge No. 22 in Virginia, participated in the proceedings with full formal dignity. This fact is real. It is documented. It is also, depending on which tradition of interpretation you belong to, either evidence of a deeply personal commitment to a fraternity that Washington genuinely valued, or the final confirmation of a lifelong conspiracy to build a Masonic republic on the bones of a Christian one. Neither interpretation is quite right. Getting to what is actually true about Washington, about Freemasonry, and about the American founding requires holding two things simultaneously: that the Masonic connections of many founding figures were genuine and significant, and that the significance has been systematically exaggerated in ways that distort rather than illuminate the actual history. Start with the facts. Washington joined the Fredericksburg Lodge in Virginia in 1752 at the age of 20. He was raised to the degree of Master Mason the following year. He maintained his Masonic affiliation for the rest of his life, though his actual lodge attendance in later decades was irregular. In 1788, he was elected Worshipful Master of Alexandria, Lodge No. 22, a role he held for a period before his responsibilities made sustained participation difficult. He wore his Masonic apron at the cornerstone ceremony for the United States Capitol in 1793. He corresponded with lodges across the country and accepted honorary memberships from several. None of this is secret. All of it is documented. Benjamin Franklin's Masonic career was deeper and more sustained. He joined St. John's Lodge in Philadelphia in 1731 and became Grand Master of Pennsylvania in 1734. He published the first American edition of Anderson's Constitutions in the same year. He remained an active participant in Masonic life for decades, and when he arrived in Paris as American ambassador, he found in the French Lodge network a social infrastructure he already knew how to use. Franklin's correspondence suggests he regarded lodge life as one of the genuinely valuable forms of association available to a man of his particular kind of mind and ambition. A view consistent with his sustained engagement with the fraternity across 4 decades on 2 continents. Other founding figures with documented Masonic membership include John Hancock and Paul Revere, who served as Grand Master of Massachusetts. The roster of Masonic founding fathers is long enough that no serious historian disputes the basic picture. Freemasonry was deeply embedded in the social world of the men who built the American Republic. The question is what that embeddedness meant. The conspiracy tradition has a clear answer. The republic they built was a Masonic republic, structured according to Masonic principles and decorated with Masonic symbols that serve as permanent evidence of the fraternity's founding role. And the most visible piece of evidence for all of this, the image on the back of every American $1 bill, is the Eye of Providence floating above an unfinished pyramid. A symbol so obviously Masonic that its presence on the national currency can only be explained as a deliberate statement of hidden power. This argument has been made in books, in films, in television, documentaries, and in the kind of late-night research that feels like discovery and functions like confirmation bias. It is also, on the specific question of the Great Seal, demonstrably wrong in a way that illustrates precisely how this kind of argument works when it engages with historical evidence. The Great Seal of the United States was designed by a committee that included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. The process took 6 years, from 1776 to 1782, and went through 3 separate committees before a final design was adopted. The Eye of Providence, the all-seeing eye within a triangle, was suggested in the 3rd Committee's deliberations by a Philadelphia lawyer and heraldic expert named William Barton, who was advising on the design and who was not known to have been a Freemason. The unfinished pyramid below it had been suggested by the 2nd Committee. The symbolism Barton drew on was not primarily Masonic. The Eye of Providence was a well-established Christian symbol for divine oversight, used in European religious art for centuries before Freemasonry existed. The pyramid was a symbol of permanence and antiquity with roots in the classical tradition. Neither symbol was Masonic in origin, and neither was understood as Masonic by the committee members who adopted them in 1782. The Eye of Providence became associated with Freemasonry in popular culture in the 19th and 20th centuries, well after the Great Seal was designed, as Masonic lodges incorporated the symbol into their own iconography. The conspiracy narrative requires you to read that later association backward in time. To treat a symbol as Masonic in 1782 because it became associated with Masonic lodges after that date. This is precisely the chronological reversal that makes this kind of historical argument impossible to falsify. Any symbol that was later adopted by any Masonic lodge becomes retrospective evidence of Masonic influence at an earlier time. What, then, were the genuine Masonic influences on the founding of the American Republic? They were real, but they operated at the level of culture and social practice rather than at the level of coded symbols or secret directives. The lodge gave the men who participated in it a specific set of experiences that shaped how they thought about organizing human association. For many of them, the lodge was the primary institution in their lives, where they had actually practiced the habits that Republican government required: the election of officers, the conduct of meetings under procedural rules, the cultivation of a sense of fraternal obligation that crossed lines of rank and origin, the Masonic emphasis on the equality of brothers within the lodge, imperfect and limited as it was, also fed into the ideological climate of the founding. The rhetoric of brotherhood, of men bound together by shared commitment rather than by birth or blood, resonated with the Republican project of building a nation on principles rather than on dynasty. This is not a claim about secret influence. It is a claim about the way ideas move through social networks. And the Lodge was one of the social networks through which the ideas of the Enlightenment moved into the political practice of the founding generation. There is one more aspect of the American Masonic story that deserves direct attention, because it complicates the flattering version as thoroughly as the conspiracy version. The Freemasonry of the American founding was an exclusively white institution. The lodges that Washington and Franklin and Revere participated in did not admit black men. When Prince Hall and his companions sought membership in American lodges in the 1770s and were refused, they obtained their charter from the Grand Lodge of England instead. The story of Prince Hall Masonry, which will be addressed in a later chapter, is the story of what happens when an organization's stated values and its actual practices are in fundamental contradiction. The Founding Fathers, who were Freemasons, were men of their time and their class. Their Masonic membership did not prevent them from holding enslaved people. It did not prompt them to extend the Brotherhood of the Lodge to men of African descent. The universal brotherhood that Masonic rhetoric proclaimed was, in practice, a brotherhood of white men of a certain social standing. This does not erase the genuine contributions of Masonic culture to American civic life, but it prevents any honest account from treating those contributions as the whole story. What the evidence actually shows about Freemasonry and the American founding is neither the grand conspiracy nor the innocent coincidence. It shows an organization deeply embedded in the social world of the founding generation, contributing specific cultural habits and rhetorical resources to the project of building a republic, used by its members in ways that shaped their civic lives without controlling their political decisions, and carrying within it, from the beginning, the same contradictions between stated ideals and actual practice that the republic itself carried. The Lodge was a mirror of the founding, not its engine. What the Founding Fathers saw in that mirror was what they chose to see, and what they built from what they saw was, as with the Republic itself, both more and less than they claimed it was. On the 11th of September, 1826, a man was taken from a jail in Canandaigua, New York, placed in a carriage, and driven away into the darkness. His name was William Morgan. He was a printer living in the small town of Batavia in western New York. He was not a prominent man. He had failed at several business ventures and was known locally as someone whose ambitions did not always match his reliability. By the standards of the successful merchants, lawyers, and landowners who dominated lodge life in western New York, he was a marginal figure. What he had, and what made him dangerous in the eyes of people who wished him ill, was a manuscript. Morgan had written a full account of Masonic ritual and ceremony, including the specific words, gestures, and grips of the first 3 degrees. He had found a publisher in Batavia willing to print it. He intended to sell it. He was never seen again. In the weeks before his disappearance, attempts had been made to prevent the publication by various means. The print shop was set on fire. Legal actions were brought against Morgan on dubious charges, resulting in his arrest and brief imprisonment. And then came the night of the 11th of September. A group of men arrived at the jail. Morgan was taken. The carriage disappeared into the dark. What happened to William Morgan after that night has never been definitively established. The most probable explanation, supported by the weight of subsequent investigation, is that he was killed and his body disposed of in or near the Niagara River. A body was found in the river several weeks later and identified by Morgan's wife as her husband, though the identification was later disputed and became itself a subject of controversy that distracted from the larger issue for years. No one was ever convicted of William Morgan's murder. This last fact is the one that matters most, and it requires careful examination. What it reveals is not the story of a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but something considerably more troubling. The story of how a dense network of institutional loyalty can produce systematic injustice without any central coordination. The men who took Morgan from the jail were Masons. The witnesses who might have identified them were largely Masons. The grand jurors called to investigate the disappearance included Masons. The trial jurors who heard the cases against the men eventually charged included Masons. The judges who presided were, in some instances, Masons. The sheriffs responsible for executing warrants were Masons. None of this required a meeting at Grand Lodge headquarters at which someone gave orders to obstruct justice. That is precisely the point. The network did not need to be directed to function as a network. Men who shared lodge membership, who had sworn oaths of mutual assistance, who socialized together and did business together and sat on each other's juries, did what people in dense social networks do when one of their own is in trouble. They found ways to help. Some of those ways were probably innocent. A witness who genuinely did not remember clearly. A juror who genuinely had reasonable doubt. But the pattern across dozens of proceedings in multiple counties over several years is too consistent to be explained by coincidence. The result was a series of trials that produced sentences ranging from 1 month to 28 months for men implicated in a probable murder. No one was convicted of murder. The justice system of Western New York, staffed at nearly every level by men with Masonic affiliations, had processed the probable killing of a man by Masons and produced outcomes that were, to put it plainly, not proportionate to what had occurred. The public reaction was volcanic. Western New York, in 1826, was a region in the middle of a profound religious and social transformation. The area had been swept repeatedly by evangelical revivals, earning it the nickname the Burned-Over District for the intensity of the religious fires that had passed through it. The population was deeply suspicious of concentrated power, deeply committed to a version of Protestant Christianity that emphasized individual conscience over institutional authority, and deeply alert to anything that looked like a secret elite operating above the law. What the Morgan affair looked like to this population was exactly that. A secret society had taken a man for threatening to expose its secrets. Its members had then used their control of public institutions to ensure that justice was not done. The political response was remarkable and historically underappreciated. The anti-Masonic party emerged from the outrage over the Morgan affair and became the first significant third party in American political history. At its peak in the early 1830s, it controlled the governorships of several northeastern states and sent representatives to Congress. It developed the political primary as a tool for Democratic candidate selection, a procedural innovation that outlasted the party itself and became a permanent feature of American democratic practice. It held the first national nominating convention in American history, in Baltimore, in 1831, establishing a model that all subsequent major parties would follow. The party's specific target was Masonic influence in public life. It demanded that judges, sheriffs, legislators, and other public officials disclose their Masonic membership and recuse themselves from matters involving Masonic interests. It argued that secret societies were incompatible with Republican government, that men who had sworn private oaths of mutual assistance could not be trusted to exercise public power impartially. These arguments were not unreasonable. The Morgan affair had provided concrete evidence that the concern was not merely theoretical, and the institutional response that the anti-Masonic movement produced, the insistence on transparency and disclosure as conditions for the exercise of public power, anticipated concerns about conflicts of interest and institutional capture that are recognizable in the vocabulary of democratic reform to this day. Freemasonry's response to the crisis was, initially, to defend itself, and then, gradually, to diminish. Membership in northeastern states dropped sharply through the 1830s. Many lodges went dark, suspending operations rather than continuing in the face of public hostility. The crisis revealed something important about what Freemasonry had become by the 1820s that was different from what it had been a century earlier. In the Enlightenment Lodge of the 1700s, membership had been a matter of social and intellectual cultivation. The lodge supplemented the institutions of public life without substantially overlapping with them. The lodge room was a space apart from the courthouse and the legislature, offering something different rather than something competing. By the 1820s in the United States, Freemasonry had grown so large and had recruited so broadly from the class of men who staffed public institutions that the separation had dissolved. The lodge was no longer a space apart. It was continuous with the courthouse, the legislature, the sheriff's office, and the jury room. Because the same men inhabited all of these spaces, the private oath of mutual assistance that a Mason swore to his brothers had become, in practice, a commitment that could override the public oath that the same man swore when he took office. This is not the story of a malevolent conspiracy. It is the story of an institution that had grown beyond the social context that made it functional. The lodge did not set out to subvert justice. Its members set out to protect each other, which is what they had promised to do. The problem was that protecting each other, in the specific circumstances of 1826, required subverting justice. The anti-Masonic party understood this. Its argument was not that Masons were evil. It was that the structure of secret mutual obligation was incompatible with the structure of public accountability. You could not hold both oaths simultaneously without one eventually taking precedence over the other. William Morgan's manuscript was published posthumously. It revealed nothing that had not been revealed in dozens of earlier exposés. The information it contained was not dangerous. The man who wrote it was dead. The men who had taken him received, at most, a few months in prison. The secret that Freemasonry was actually keeping in 1826 was not the words of the third degree. It was the capacity of a sufficiently dense network of private loyalty to render public accountability optional. That secret, unlike the ritual secrets, had never been published. It had simply been demonstrated. On a February evening in 1882, Maria de Riesmes walked into a lodge room in the town of Pec, outside Paris, and did not walk out as the same person she had been when she entered. She was 51 years old. She was a writer and a public intellectual, one of the most prominent voices in the French women's rights movement. She had spent decades arguing, in newspapers and lecture halls and parliamentary petitions, for women's access to education, to the professions, to full participation in the civic life of the Republic. She understood, with the precision that comes from years of fighting institutions, exactly what she was doing when she agreed to be initiated into the lodge called Les Libres Penseurs, the Free Thinkers. She was not joining a social club. She was making an argument. The argument was this: if a fraternity claims that its values are universal, if it says that rank and birth and doctrine matter less than character and commitment, if it builds its entire symbolic vocabulary around the idea that the lodge is a space where ordinary distinctions are suspended, then it cannot indefinitely exclude the majority of humanity from those values without calling into question whether it holds them at all. The Grand Orient of France, the country's principal Masonic governing body, responded within months. The lodge that had initiated Maria de Riesmes was suspended. Its charter was revoked. The men who had voted to admit her were told, in formal institutional language, that what they had done violated the fundamental landmarks of the fraternity and could not be recognized. The lodge had applied the organization's stated principles without exception. The organization had punished the lodge for doing so. That exchange, played out in 1882, in a town outside Paris, is one of the sharpest illustrations of the gap that runs through the entire institution between what it claims to be and what it has actually been willing to become. The exclusion of women was built into the institution from its earliest formal documents. Anderson's Constitutions of 1723 state plainly that the candidate for initiation must be a man. No argument is offered. No justification is given. In the social world of early 18th century Britain, none was considered necessary. What changed was the world outside the lodge, and the world outside the lodge changed faster than the institution was prepared to follow. In France, where Freemasonry arrived in the 1730s and adapted to a social culture with different habits, the question of women's participation arose within a generation. The French aristocratic tradition of the salon, the mixed-gender intellectual gathering that had no real equivalent in Britain, made the exclusion of women from lodge proceedings an awkwardness that French Masons moved to address through a solution that was characteristically French. Acknowledge the problem without resolving it. Create a parallel. The lodges of adoption emerged in France in the 1740s and became formalized under Grand Orient sponsorship by the 1770s. A lodge of adoption was affiliated with a regular male lodge, but conducted its own ceremonies and admitted women as members. The ceremonies drew on the same symbolic vocabulary, but were different from the regular Masonic degrees. The lodge met under the formal authority of the affiliated male lodge, though day-to-day direction was exercised by a woman who held the title of Mistress of the Adoption Lodge. It was a masterpiece of institutional compromise. Women could participate in Masonic sociability. The foundational rule of male-only regular lodges remained untouched. Everyone could behave as if the problem had been solved, while ensuring that the underlying architecture remained intact. This arrangement satisfied women who valued the sociability over the principle. It did not satisfy women who understood that the principle was the point. Maria de Reismes was in the second category. After her initiation and the subsequent suspension of les libres penseurs, she spent the following decade in correspondence and negotiation with like-minded men in the French Masonic world. In 1893, 11 years after that February evening, in Pec, she and a French Mason known as Georges Martin co-founded a new order called Le Droit Humain, human rights. The name was not an accident. The order's founding principle was that universal values required universal membership, and that an institution committed to reason and progress had an obligation to apply those commitments to its own structure. Le Droit Humain conferred the full 3 degrees of craft masonry on both men and women, using the same ritual and the same symbolic content for both. It organized itself under a mixed-gender governance structure, and it grew, slowly at first, then more steadily, into an international organization with lodges across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Annie Besant joined Le Droit Humain in 1902 and became one of its most prominent leaders. By that point, Besant was one of the most recognized public intellectuals in the English-speaking world, a former socialist activist and trade union organizer turned theosophist, whose writing and lecturing had reached audiences across 4 continents. Her involvement gave the order a profile it would not otherwise have had. The existence of Le Droit Humain did not resolve the question of women's membership in mainstream Freemasonry. The United Grand Lodge of England, the oldest and most influential regular Masonic body in the world, has never admitted women. The Grand Lodges of the United States operate under the same exclusion. These bodies do not recognize Le Droit Humain as regular Masonry. Members of regular lodges who join the co-Masonic order risk having their regular membership revoked. The situation today is a patchwork that reflects the history of the argument rather than any resolution of it. There are regular lodges, all male, recognized by the United Grand Lodge of England. There are women's lodges in England, organized under 2 Grand Lodges, entirely separate from the United Grand Lodge and not recognized by it, that confer full Masonic degrees using the same ritual as regular lodges. There is Le Droit Humain and its affiliated mixed-gender orders, and there is a growing number of jurisdictions, particularly in continental Europe and Latin America, where the question has been resolved in different ways. What Maria de Reismes walked into in that lodge room in Pec in 1882 was not simply an initiation ceremony. It was a collision between a set of stated values and the institution that claimed to hold them. That collision has not been resolved. The argument she made that evening, in the clearest possible way, by simply being there, is still being made. The lodge that initiated her was shut down. The order she helped found is still meeting. On the evening of the 6th of March, 1775, near Bunker Hill in Boston, a British Army lodge initiated 15 men. They were free black men from Boston and the surrounding area. Their leader, the man who had sought out the lodge and arranged the initiations, was named Prince Hall. He was approximately 30 years old, though his exact age is uncertain because the records of his early life are incomplete in the way that the records of free black men in colonial America are often incomplete. By 1775, he was a free man in Boston, a leather worker by trade, a property owner, and a figure of growing influence in Boston's free black community. What Prince Hall wanted from Freemasonry is suggested by everything he subsequently did with it. He wanted, for himself and for the community he was part of, access to the network, the institutional legitimacy, and the civic standing that Masonic membership provided for white men in the world of 1775. The lodge was one of the primary social technologies of the Anglo-American world for organizing the kind of civil society that Republican government required. Prince Hall understood this with the clarity of a man who had been excluded from the institutions that conferred that understanding on others. He wanted in. The British Army Lodge gave him in. What American Freemasonry did next illustrates, with a precision that is almost clinical in its clarity, the gap between an institution's stated values and its actual practice. After the Revolutionary War ended and the British Army departed, Hall and his fellow initiates were left with an anomalous status. They had been properly initiated into Freemasonry by a warranted lodge. They were Masons by any technical definition of the term, but the emerging Grand Lodge of Massachusetts refused to acknowledge them. No official reason was recorded. None was needed. The refusal expressed something that everyone involved understood, without it being said. Hall responded with a patience and strategic intelligence that his subsequent reputation has not always adequately recognized. Rather than accepting the refusal as final, he began the process of obtaining a warrant from another legitimate source. In 1784, after years of correspondence and petition, African Lodge received its charter from the Grand Lodge of England on the 29th of September. The oldest and most authoritative Masonic body in the world had recognized what the new American Republic's Masonic establishment had refused to recognize. The irony was not lost on anyone who considered it carefully. The new Republic, which had just fought a war for independence against British authority, in part on the grounds that all men were created equal, had produced a Masonic establishment that refused to recognize Black Masons. Those Black Masons had obtained their legitimacy from the British institution that the Republic had rejected. African Lodge under Prince Hall proceeded to do what lodges do. It organized. It recruited. It built a community. It provided a framework for mutual assistance and civic engagement. Hall himself became a public figure of considerable influence, petitioning the Massachusetts legislature for the abolition of slavery and for the provision of public education to black children, using the standing that his lodge gave him to make arguments in the public sphere that he might not otherwise have had the platform to make. When Hall died in 1807, he left behind an institution that was genuinely functional, genuinely valued by its members, and genuinely separate from the white Masonic establishment that had refused to acknowledge it. That establishment's refusal had not destroyed what Hall built. It had, paradoxically, ensured that what Hall built would develop independently, would accumulate its own traditions and its own leadership, and would become something that could not be absorbed or controlled by the institution that had excluded it. Prince Hall Masonry grew steadily through the 19th century, despite sustained resistance from white Masonic bodies that refused to recognize it as legitimate. The argument white Grand Lodges made was technical. Prince Hall lodges were clandestine, operating outside the recognized regular Masonic structure, and their members could not be acknowledged without violating the rules of the fraternity. This argument required a convenient unawareness of its own implications. The Grand Lodge of England had issued the original warrant. The technical grounds for calling Prince Hall lodges clandestine were, at best, uncertain, and the uncertainty had been created in part by the refusal of American Grand Lodges to maintain normal fraternal relations with African Lodge after it received its British charter. The argument was circular, in a way that its makers appear to have found useful rather than troubling. The practical effect was a dual system of Masonry in the United States that persisted, in most states, through most of the 19th century and well into the 20th, one system for white men, one for black men, each operating in parallel, each claiming legitimacy, neither fully recognizing the other. Within this separate system, Prince Hall Masonry became something that its exclusion from the white establishment had inadvertently made possible, a primary civic institution of the black professional and middle class in the United States. The lodge provided for black men in a society that denied them access to most institutions of civic life exactly what it had provided for white men in an earlier era, a space for organizing, networking, developing leadership, and cultivating the habits and relationships that civic participation required. The roster of Prince Hall Masons includes figures whose significance in American history extends far beyond their Masonic membership. Booker T. Washington, whose influence over black American educational and economic life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was profound, was a Prince Hall Mason. Thurgood Marshall, who argued Brown v. Board of Education before the Supreme Court and later became the first black Supreme Court justice, was a Prince Hall Mason. The organization was not a sideshow to black American civic life in this period. It was one of its primary institutional expressions, where the previous chapter traces an argument made through personal conviction and direct confrontation. The Prince Hall story is one of institutional endurance under political exclusion. Maria Deraismes challenged the institution from a position of relative social privilege and chose confrontation as her method. Prince Hall faced an institution that had already refused him and chose, without the option of confrontation on equal terms, to build around the refusal. Both built something lasting. Both demonstrated, in their different ways, that the values Freemasonry claimed to hold were capable of being practiced by people the fraternity had declined to include. The formal exclusion began to end in the latter half of the 20th century. The first state Grand Lodge to extend formal recognition to its Prince Hall counterpart was the Grand Lodge of Connecticut in 1989. Others followed gradually through the 90s and into the 2000s. As of the early 21st century, a small number of state Grand Lodges in the American South still do not extend formal recognition to Prince Hall Grand Lodges, a position that the United Grand Lodge of England, which recognized Prince Hall Masonry decades earlier, regards as inconsistent with the principles of the fraternity. The institution that Hall built to make his counter-argument is still meeting in lodge rooms across the United States, with members who know exactly why it was built and what it was built to say. In the autumn of 1797, a French Jesuit priest named Augustin Baruel sat down in London, where he had fled after the Revolution, and published the first volume of a work that would change, permanently and profoundly, the way a large portion of the Western world thought about secret organizations. The work was called Mémoires pour servir à l'histoire du Jacobinisme, which translates roughly as Memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism. It argued, with the systematic thoroughness of a man trained in scholastic logic, that the French Revolution had not been a spontaneous uprising of the people against an unjust order. It had been the planned and coordinated result of a conspiracy involving three interlocking groups: the philosophers of the Enlightenment, the Freemasons, and the Illuminati. Each had played a specific role. The philosophers had corrupted the minds of the educated class. The Freemasons had provided the organizational network. The Illuminati had supplied the directing intelligence. Together, they had engineered the destruction of Christian civilization in France. Barruel was not a stupid man. He was not, by the standards of his time and his tradition, an unreasonable one. He had watched the revolution unfold from inside France before fleeing, had seen the execution of priests and the dismantling of the church. His need to explain what had happened was genuine. His explanation was wrong in ways that are important to understand precisely, because the wrongness has been reproduced in variations ever since. The core error was not the observation that many revolutionary figures were Freemasons. That observation was correct. A significant number of the men who participated in the revolution had lodge affiliations. This is documented. The error was the inference from that observation to the conclusion that their lodge affiliations had caused their revolutionary politics, that the lodge was the mechanism through which the conspiracy had operated. This inference required treating correlation as causation, assuming that because two things were associated, they were therefore connected by intent, and interpreting the absence of direct evidence of coordination as evidence of how sophisticated the concealment was, rather than as evidence that the coordination did not exist. These are errors of reasoning that are easy to identify in retrospect. They are considerably harder to identify when you are living through the events being explained, and when the explanation feels like it accounts for the magnitude of what has happened. The magnitude problem is worth pausing on. The French Revolution was a world historical event of staggering scale. It overturned a social and political order that had been in place for centuries. It killed tens of thousands of people. It dismantled the institutional church in France. It executed a king. For people who believed, as Barruel believed, that the existing order was not merely convenient, but divinely sanctioned. The revolution demanded an explanation commensurate with its scale, a structural explanation, one that pointed to fiscal crisis and crop failures and the accumulated grievances of a population governed by a dysfunctional system, was in a psychological sense inadequate. It was too diffuse, too impersonal, too lacking in identifiable agents. A conspiracy theory provided what the structural explanation could not: people who had chosen to do this, people who had planned it, people who were responsible for it in a way that made moral judgment possible. This psychological function of conspiracy thinking, the transformation of impersonal structural forces into the deliberate acts of identifiable enemies, is not specific to Barruel or to the 1790s. It appears wherever the gap between the scale of an event and the adequacy of available explanations becomes large enough to generate anxiety. And it is durable precisely because it meets a genuine psychological need. Not a foolish one, but a human one. The Illuminati that Barruel incorporated into his conspiracy theory had actually existed. Adam Weishaupt, a professor of law at the University of Ingolstadt in Bavaria, founded the Order of the Illuminati in 1776. It was a genuinely secret society with explicitly political goals: the promotion of Enlightenment values and the reduction of religious and political tyranny through the gradual infiltration of influential positions in society. The organization was suppressed by the Bavarian government in 1785. After documents describing its activities and membership were seized, Weishaupt fled into exile. The organization ceased to function as an institution. No credible institutional continuity has been demonstrated after its suppression. The Illuminati that Barruel described as directing the French Revolution, 12 years after the organization's documented dissolution, was not the historical Illuminati of Weishaupt. It was a projection, a name applied to a hypothesis about hidden power that the actual organization had never possessed and could not have exercised by the time Barruel was writing. None of this diminished the influence of Barruel's work. The memoirs were translated into multiple languages within years of publication. They were read across Europe and in the United States. They provided the basic template for anti-Masonic literature for the next 2 centuries. And the template had a specific structure that made it extraordinarily durable. It was unfalsifiable. In Barruel's framework, any evidence that seemed to contradict the conspiracy theory could be incorporated as further evidence of the conspiracy's sophistication. Lodges that appeared to be innocuous social clubs were clearly the public face of a deeper organization. Members who seemed genuinely committed to charitable work were clearly useful idiots who did not know what their own institution was really doing. Documents that showed no evidence of coordination were clearly the result of effective concealment. The theory explained everything and was threatened by nothing. This unfalsifiability is the characteristic that distinguishes conspiracy thinking from genuine historical analysis. It is what makes conspiracy theories about Freemasonry so persistent despite the existence of extensive archival evidence about what the organization actually was and did. The specific motifs that Berulle assembled. The secret organization with ancient roots. The network of apparently respectable public figures concealing a hidden agenda. The manipulation of democratic institutions from behind closed doors. Were picked up, recycled, and redeployed by a succession of writers and movements across the 19th and 20th centuries. The rhetorical patterns traveled further and more durably than the specific historical claims, which were debunked and revised but kept reappearing in new forms that drew on the same underlying logic. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, the anti-Semitic forgery that circulated widely in the early 20th century and contributed to the climate that made the Holocaust possible, drew explicitly on the Barrowellian template, substituting Jewish leaders for Masonic ones but maintaining the same basic structure, a secret network of conspirators with an ancient plan for world domination. Operating through the infiltration of legitimate institutions, the document was exposed as a forgery, largely plagiarized from an 1864 political satire. As early as 1921, by the journalist Philip Graves, writing in the Times of London. It continued to circulate and to influence political movements for decades after its fabrication was established. What is important to understand about this history is not that the people who believed these theories were uniformly stupid or malicious. It is that the template they were using is cognitively compelling in ways that straightforward historical analysis is not. Conspiracy theories provide certainty in the face of complexity. They provide agency in the face of impersonal forces. They provide enemies in the face of diffuse structural problems. And they provide community. The shared knowledge of the hidden truth creates a bond among those who possess it that is not unlike the bond the lodge itself was designed to create. The irony is precise. The conspiracy theory about Freemasonry replicates, in its social function, the thing it fears. It creates a community of people who believe they know something that the uninitiated do not, who are bound together by that shared knowledge, and who interpret challenges to that knowledge as evidence of the very conspiracy they are describing. What the historical record of Freemasonry actually shows, read without the template that Berulle provided, is an organization that has been many things in many times and places: a social club, a school for civic practice, a network of mutual assistance, an instrument of colonial administration, a space for philosophical exploration, an institutional expression of racial and gender exclusion, and a fraternity of men who found in ritual and brotherhood something that the rest of their lives was not providing. None of these things are secret. All of them are documented. The conspiracy theory has survived not because the evidence supports it, but because the evidence is not what the conspiracy theory is about. It is about the need to believe that someone, somewhere, is in control of the forces that feel out of control. That need is not going away, and as long as it exists, Freemasonry will continue to serve, for some people, as its preferred answer. On a morning in 1925, officials of the Italian government arrived at lodge halls across the country with orders that were simple, unambiguous, and backed by the full apparatus of a state that was rapidly discarding the procedural constraints of parliamentary democracy. The lodges were to close. Their records were to be surrendered. Their members were to disperse. Benito Mussolini had been consolidating power in Italy since his march on Rome in 1922. His relationship with Freemasonry had been one of the more complicated features of his early political career. He had, at various points, expressed sympathy for Masonic values. Some of his early political allies had been Masons. The Italian Masonic establishment had initially viewed the fascist movement with something between cautious tolerance and active support, calculating, incorrectly, that a strong nationalist government would be preferable to the socialist alternative. By 1925, that calculation was over. Freemasonry was not going to be a tool of fascism. It was going to be an obstacle to it. And obstacles, in the political grammar that Mussolini was developing, were not debated. They were eliminated. The specific reasons for the suppression illuminate something important about the relationship between certain kinds of political power and certain kinds of civil organization that goes beyond the Italian case. The most obvious reason was political. The Italian Masonic lodges, particularly those affiliated with the Grand Orient of Italy, the country's principal Masonic governing body, had been deeply involved in the Risorgimento and in the subsequent construction of the liberal Italian state. They were associated with precisely the values that fascism was in the process of declaring its enemies: individual rights, parliamentary government, the rule of law, the separation of church and state. But the political explanation, while accurate as far as it goes, does not fully account for the energy that fascist and other totalitarian regimes brought to the suppression of Freemasonry. The same intensity appeared in Germany after 1933, in Spain under Franco, in Vichy France, and in the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Most major 20th-century totalitarian regimes, despite disagreeing profoundly about almost everything else, agreed that Freemasonry had to be eliminated. The consistency demands explanation. The explanation lies in something structural about how totalitarian power works and what it requires. Totalitarian government depends on a specific kind of loyalty, total, undivided, and directed toward the state or the movement as the single, legitimate, organizing principle of social life. Every other loyalty, to family, to profession, to religion, to any voluntary association that exists independently of state control, is a potential competitor to the loyalty the state requires. These competing loyalties do not have to be consciously oppositional to be threatening. Their very existence as independent sources of obligation is the problem. The Masonic Lodge embodied this problem in a particularly concentrated form. A man who was a lodge brother had sworn an obligation to his brothers that was prior to any subsequent obligation he might incur. He was bound to assist his brothers, to keep their confidences, to appear for them when called. This obligation was not contingent on the brothers being good citizens or loyal subjects. It was an obligation to them as brothers. Full stop. For a totalitarian regime that required its citizens to have no loyalty prior to their loyalty to the state, this was not a minor irritant. It was a structural challenge. The lodge brother who appeared before a fascist or Nazi tribunal faced a conflict between two oaths that the regime could not tolerate. There was also a specific feature of lodge organization that totalitarian surveillance states found practically threatening. The lodge maintained a network of relationships among its members that was private, that operated through channels the state did not control, and that created patterns of communication and mutual assistance that were, in principle, invisible to external monitoring. In a state that required total transparency to function, an organization explicitly structured around private mutual obligation was not merely symbolically threatening, it was operationally threatening. Hitler had been writing and speaking about Freemasonry as an enemy since the early 1920s, embedding his opposition in the broader anti-Semitic framework that shaped his entire worldview. This drew directly on the Barrowellian tradition, filtered through the specific obsessions of Nazi ideology. The practical consequences were severe. Lodge halls were seized. Masonic libraries and archives were confiscated. Members were required to disclose their affiliations and faced professional and, in many cases, criminal consequences. Some were imprisoned. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has documented that Freemasons were among the groups targeted by the Nazi regime for persecution, that lodge members were arrested, and that some were sent to concentration camps. The specific application of persecution policies varied across camps and across the period of the regime's operation. And the historical documentation of the exact treatment of Masonic prisoners is less complete than for other persecuted groups, partly because Masonic prisoners were often categorized under broader designations rather than specifically as Masons. Various Masonic memorial organizations have published estimates of the total losses that range very high. Historians who work with the primary documentation treat these figures with caution, noting that the evidentiary basis for precise numbers is limited by the incompleteness of surviving records. What the documentation establishes clearly is that Masonic membership was a basis for persecution, that Masons were arrested and imprisoned, and that some died as a result. The conspiracy tradition held that Freemasonry was suppressed by totalitarian regimes because it was their real opposition, the hidden liberal network working to undermine national sovereignty. This interpretation makes the suppression look like confirmation of the conspiracy theory. It is partially right and fundamentally misleading. Partially right in that the lodge did represent values, individual conscience, voluntary association, horizontal loyalty, that were genuinely incompatible with totalitarian organization. Fundamentally misleading in that it attributes to Freemasonry a conscious oppositional agency that the organization did not possess and was not exercising. The lodge was not fighting fascism. It was simply being what it was, an organization of men bound by private mutual obligation. And that was enough to make it incompatible with a political system that required all obligation to run through the state. In Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in France under occupation, the lodge rooms went dark. The aprons were hidden or destroyed. The records were seized. The members scattered. And then, when the regimes that had suppressed the lodges were themselves destroyed, the lodge rooms opened again. Men who had kept their aprons hidden for 12 years or 20 years or 30 years took them out and put them on and called each other brother. This is not a triumphalist story. Many of those men had died in the interval. The reopening of the lodge rooms was not a vindication of any historical thesis. It was simply what happened. Men who had been bound to each other by an oath they had not renounced found each other again and resumed the work of the lodge. The work was the same work it had always been. The cultivation of brotherhood in a world that repeatedly demonstrates how fragile brotherhood is. Conducted in a room with a checkered floor and a set of symbols whose meaning each member was free to interpret for himself. Picture a lodge hall in a mid-sized American city. The year is 1959. The parking lot fills an hour before the meeting starts. Men arrive in suite, most of them still wearing the ties they wore to work. They are factory supervisors and insurance agents and hardware store owners and high school principals. They are veterans of the Second World War and the Korean War. Men who spent years in uniform among strangers and came home with a specific hunger for the kind of organized male community that military life had provided, and civilian life did not automatically replace. The lodge hall is warm. The conversation before the meeting is loud. There is a waiting list to join that runs to several months. Now picture the same hall in 1985. The parking lot is half full. The men who arrive are older. Some of the faces from 1959 are gone, moved away or dead. The waiting list has become a welcoming committee that reaches out to prospects rather than waiting for them to appear. The conversation before the meeting is quieter. There is a quality to the room that is not yet decline, but is already something different from what it was. Now picture the same hall in 2005. 12 men sit in a room built for 100. The average age is somewhere past 60. The officers' chairs are filled by men who hold 2 positions each because there are not enough members to fill them separately. After the meeting, someone raises the question of whether the lodge can afford to maintain the building, whether it might be time to consolidate with another lodge 2 towns over. The conversation is careful and sad, in the way that conversations about necessary endings always are. This is not a fictional composite. It is a description, assembled from documented accounts, lodge histories, and sociological research of what happened to hundreds of American Masonic lodges across the second half of the 20th century. The specifics vary. The arc does not. The numbers tell the story in their most compressed form. American Freemasonry reached its peak membership of approximately 4.3 million in 1959. By the early years of the 21st century, that number had fallen to approximately 1.1 million. By 2023, figures from the Masonic Service Association of North America indicated membership of approximately 869,000 in roughly 60 years. The organization lost nearly 4/5 of the membership it had accumulated over the previous 2.5 centuries. This is one of the most dramatic institutional declines in American civic history, and it has received, proportionally, very little serious public attention. What the evidence shows is that Freemasonry's decline is not primarily a story about Freemasonry. The sociologist Robert Putnam documented, in his book, Bowling Alone, published in the year 2000, a pattern of civic decline across American society, so broad and so consistent across institution types that it could not be explained by anything specific to any individual organization. The Rotary Club lost members. The Knights of Columbus lost members. The Parent-Teacher Association lost members. Bowling leagues lost members, which gave Putnam his title and his central image. Americans were bowling more than ever. But they were bowling alone, rather than in organized leagues. The fraternal organization, the civic club, the neighborhood association, the union local, the church congregation, all of the institutions that had organized American social life outside the family and the workplace for most of the 20th century were losing members simultaneously and for overlapping reasons. Putnam identified several contributing factors. The entry of women into the paid workforce in large numbers reduced the time available for evening and weekend associational activity. The spread of television and later other screen-based entertainment created a private substitute for the social engagement that lodge meetings and club nights had previously provided. Suburban sprawl increased commute times and reduced the density of local social networks. Generational shift played a role. The generation that had built these organizations, the men who had come of age during the Depression and the Second World War, was aging out, and the generations that followed did not share their institutional habits. None of these factors is specific to Freemasonry. All of them bear on Freemasonry. The post-war peak itself requires explanation. The men who returned from the Second World War brought with them specific social needs. They had spent years in institutions, in the military, in organized collective activity, in the kind of sustained male community that war creates. They came home to a country of unprecedented material prosperity, to suburbs being built at a pace that had no historical precedent, to a social environment that was physically comfortable and organizationally thin. The lodges, the veterans organizations, the civic clubs grew rapidly in this period, partly because they answered a real need. They provided the organized community that the new suburbs had not yet grown organically. By the 1970s, the children of those veterans were reaching adulthood. They had grown up in the suburbs. They had not experienced the military. They did not have the same relationship to organized male community that their fathers had. And the broader cultural shifts of the 60s and 70s made the lodge meeting seem to many young men like something their fathers did, rather than something they wanted to do. The lodge struggled with this perception and largely failed to overcome it. Attempts to modernize, to attract younger members by updating ritual and reducing meeting formality, produced mixed results. The ritual and the ceremonial structure were, for many existing members, precisely what made the lodge valuable. Changing them to attract people who did not yet see the value was, in this reading, destroying the thing in order to save it. The geographic and international pattern adds another dimension. In the United Kingdom, membership decline followed a similar but less severe trajectory. In France, some Masonic obediences have reported periods of stability or growth, particularly during the late 20th century, suggesting that certain French lodges retained a specific appeal related to their historical association with republican values and secularism. In parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Freemasonry grew through the second half of the 20th century, in contexts where it retained the function it had served in 18th-century Europe, a space for educated professionals to associate across ethnic or religious lines, to develop civic habits, and to build networks that the existing social infrastructure did not provide. This geographic variation is important because it suggests that the decline of American Freemasonry is not evidence that the thing the lodge offered is no longer wanted. It is evidence that, in specific social conditions, the lodge form stopped being the most effective way to offer it. There are, in the second and third decades of the 21st century, signs of what some observers call a Masonic revival, concentrated in urban areas among younger, more diverse demographics. Some lodges have grown by positioning themselves as spaces for the kind of thoughtful, ritualized, community-oriented experience that the surrounding culture does not provide. Whether this represents a genuine reversal of the long decline or a small countercurrent that will exhaust itself without changing the overall trajectory is not something that current evidence can determine. What is certain is that the decline of American Freemasonry in the second half of the 20th century was not a conspiracy and was not a moral failure. It was a social fact, produced by social forces that operated on dozens of institutions simultaneously, and that reflected a genuine transformation in how Americans organized their civic lives. The Lodge Hall in the mid-sized American city is still there. In most cases, the building may have been sold. The lodge may have merged with another. The parking lot may be largely empty on meeting nights, but somewhere in the city, in a smaller room, with fewer cars outside and older faces inside, the meeting is still happening. It starts on time. It follows the ritual. The worshipful master calls the lodge to order. Some things do not end cleanly. They simply continue, in a different register, with fewer voices, until the question of whether they will continue at all becomes the loudest thing in the room. There is a reading room in the library of the United Grand Lodge of England, located in a large building in Covent Garden in London, a few blocks from where the Apple Tree Tavern once stood. The library holds one of the most extensive collections of Masonic documents in the world: lodge records, correspondence, ritual texts, membership registers, legal papers, printed ephemera. Going back to the early years of the 18th century, the collection runs to hundreds of thousands of items. A researcher working in that reading room is not pursuing hidden truth. The documents are not hidden. They sit in acid-free folders in temperature-controlled storage and can be ordered to a reading desk by anyone with a legitimate research purpose who has made an appointment. The staff are professional and helpful. The gap between what that archive contains and what the general public believes about Freemasonry is not a gap created by secrecy. It is a gap created by the absence of sustained, serious scholarly attention to material that is available, but that has not been sufficiently read. The field of serious Masonic history is small. It has produced, across the past half-century, a body of work that is genuinely valuable and genuinely limited by the scale of the task relative to the number of people working on it. 3 works represent the field at its best, and the way each of them found their subject says something about why the history has been so difficult to write. David Stevenson came to Freemasonry sideways. He was a Scottish historian at the University of St. Andrews, working on the social history of 17th-century Scotland, when he noticed something in the lodge records he was reading. Men who were not stonemasons were attending stonemason lodges in Edinburgh, paying fees, being recorded as members, and then disappearing from the records as silently as they had arrived. He followed that observation carefully and without deciding in advance what it meant. And it led him to a book published in 1988 called The Origins of Freemasonry. His argument that the origins of speculative masonry are primarily Scottish rather than English, and that the crucial developmental period was the 17th century rather than the 18th, remains debated. What is not debated is the method. Read the documents. Acknowledge what they cannot tell you. Make arguments proportionate to the evidence. Stevenson did not set out to write a history of Freemasonry. He set out to understand a pattern in a set of records, and the pattern led him somewhere he had not expected to go. That is what serious historical work looks like. Margaret Jacob came to Freemasonry from the other direction, from the history of ideas. She was studying how Enlightenment political philosophy actually traveled through European society, through correspondence networks and coffee houses and private gatherings, when she kept finding the same thing. The men who were developing and spreading constitutional ideas were meeting in lodge rooms. Her book, Living the Enlightenment, published in 1991, argued that the lodge was not merely a social institution, but a political one, a space where the habits of constitutional governance were practiced rather than just discussed. Her argument has been qualified by subsequent scholars who have pointed out that the lodge was politically more diverse than her account suggests. That debate between Jacob and her critics is exactly what serious historical scholarship looks like. Competing interpretations tested against evidence, revised, refined, and never quite settled. Jessica Harlan Jacobs approached Freemasonry with a question that neither Stevenson nor Jacob had asked. Her book, Builders of Empire, published in 2007, asked not what Freemasonry meant for European liberty, but what it meant for European power. Her answer was uncomfortable for everyone. The lodge was not merely compatible with British imperialism, but was actively useful to it, providing a mechanism for integrating the diverse populations of the empire into a shared institutional framework, while preserving the social hierarchies that empire depended on. British colonial administrators, military officers, and merchants used lodge membership to establish relationships with local elites in India, in Africa, in Australia, in the Caribbean. Relationships that facilitated the administration of empire, while giving local members access to networks of influence and advancement. This argument is uncomfortable for the apologetic tradition, which wants Freemasonry to be a force for human liberation, and for the conspiracy tradition, which wants it to be a force for hidden domination. Harlan Jacobs's lodge is neither. It is an institution that served the interests of the people who used it, which in the colonial context were often the interests of empire. These three scholars, working from different questions and different archives, produce a picture of Freemasonry that is more complicated, more politically various, and more genuinely ambivalent about its own values than either the apologetic or the conspiracy tradition acknowledges. The archive contains much that scholarship has not yet addressed. The internal records of lodges across the period of Masonic growth and decline in the 20th century, the minutes of meetings, the correspondence of Grand Lodge officers, the financial records that track the material decline of the institution. These are primary sources for the social history of the 20th century that have not been systematically studied. The history of Prince Hall Masonry, despite the work of scholars who have examined black fraternal organizations in the American context, remains underrepresented in the broader literature. The international dimensions of Masonic history in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. The story of how the lodge traveled through colonial and post-colonial contexts and what it became in those contexts is a field that is just beginning to be addressed systematically. There is also a specific methodological challenge. Because Masonic lodges operated as private organizations, the documents they produced are often more candid than documents produced by organizations that expected their records to be public. Meeting minutes record debates and disputes that the participants did not expect outsiders to read. But the same privacy also creates gaps. The most sensitive matters were sometimes discussed orally rather than recorded in writing. The specific discussions that led to decisions about membership, about the exclusion of black applicants or women, about the handling of the Morgan affair, are sometimes absent from the record precisely because the people involved knew those discussions should not be written down. The history of Freemasonry has not been suppressed. It has not been fully written. Those are different things, and the difference matters more than almost anything else that can be said about a subject that has generated more heat and less light than almost any comparable topic in modern Western history. The light is in the archive. It has been there for 3 centuries. Most people have preferred the heat. There is a building in Alexandria, Virginia, that sits on a hill above the Potomac River and can be seen from a considerable distance on a clear day. It is called the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, and it was built in the 1920s and 30s in the deliberate style of the ancient lighthouse at Alexandria, Egypt, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The men who commissioned it wanted something that announced itself from a distance, something that said this has been here a long time, and it will be here a long time more. Inside the memorial, there are artifacts from Washington's own lodge, the gavel he used as worshipful master, the trowel he used at the Capitol cornerstone ceremony, his Masonic apron embroidered by Madame Lafayette. There are paintings of historical scenes, statues, displays of symbolic objects. There are meeting rooms still used by active lodges. There is a gift shop. On most days, there are tourists. It is, in its combination of genuine historical significance and careful institutional self-presentation, a near-perfect illustration of the problem that has run through this entire account. The artifacts are real. Washington's membership was real. His gavel is his gavel. And yet the experience of standing in that building and looking at those objects is shaped, at every point, by decisions about what to show and how to show it that reflect not just what Freemasonry was, but what Freemasonry has wanted to be remembered as being. The trowel is displayed. The story of the lodges that refused Prince Hall is not on the wall beside it. Washington's apron is in a case. The Morgan affair is not the subject of a diorama. The building tells a story, and the story it tells is the story the institution has chosen. This is not unique to Freemasonry. Every institution that builds a memorial to itself makes the same choices. The question is not whether the memorial is selective. Of course it is. The question is what the selectivity reveals, and what the things left out of the official story tell us that the official story cannot. What has been left out, across 3 centuries of Masonic self-presentation, is not primarily information. Most of the information is available somewhere. What has been left out is complexity. The acknowledgement that the same institution can embody genuine values and genuine failures simultaneously. That universal brotherhood is not universal if it excludes the majority of humanity. That a commitment to reason and progress is not very convincing when it is used to justify preserving structures that reason and progress should have dismantled. But this account has not been primarily about what Freemasonry left out of its own story. It has been about what each era has projected onto Freemasonry. And that is a different and more revealing subject. Consider the sequence. In the early 18th century, the men who built the institution projected onto it a usable antiquity. They needed the lodge to be ancient because a modern social club did not carry the weight they needed it to carry. Anderson's construction of a Masonic lineage running from Adam to Solomon to the great architects of Rome was not primarily a lie. It was a wish. The wish that what they were building mattered enough to have always existed. In the middle of the 18th century, the philosophers and intellectuals of the Enlightenment projected onto the lodge a political philosophy it did not quite contain. Picture Voltaire being helped to his seat in that Paris lodge room in April of 1778. Surrounded by men who had spent their careers on the same project he had spent his life on. The dismantling of superstition and the construction of something more honest in its place. He did not live long enough to attend another meeting. But in joining, he was projecting onto the fraternity everything he had spent his life arguing for. The possibility of a human community organized around reason and brotherhood rather than doctrine and hierarchy. The lodge was not that, but it was, in his last weeks, the closest available symbol for it. In the 1790s, Baruel projected onto Freemasonry the explanation he needed for the most traumatic event of his lifetime. The revolution had destroyed everything he valued. Someone had to have done it deliberately. The lodge was the most convenient available framework for that deliberate agency because it was secret, because its members were educated and influential, and because Baruel's training in systematic logic made a network-based conspiracy explanation feel like analysis rather than projection. In the 19th century, the Catholic Church projected onto Freemasonry the face of everything threatening about modernity. The lodge was not primarily threatening because of what it was doing. It was threatening because of what it represented, a model of human association that did not require the Church to authorize it, that treated religious difference as irrelevant rather than as the most important fact about a person. In the same century, the men who built American Freemasonry to its peak projected onto it the values of Republican democracy, the rhetoric of universal brotherhood, while simultaneously maintaining a racial exclusion so complete and so systematic that a separate parallel institution had to be built by the people they excluded. The projection was sincere. The gap between the projection and the practice was also sincere. Both were real simultaneously. Because institutions are not consistent, and the people who build them are not either. In the 20th century, the totalitarian movements that suppressed Freemasonry projected onto it the face of the enemy they needed. For the Nazis, it was the Jewish conspiracy. For the fascists, it was liberal internationalism. For the communists, it was bourgeois civil society. Each saw in the lodge the specific threat that its own ideology required. The lodge survived this projection not by being what its suppressors imagined, but simply by being an organization that people continued to value enough to reconstitute after the regimes that suppressed it were gone. And in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the conspiracy tradition has projected onto Freemasonry the organizing framework for its fear of hidden power. In this version, the lodge is the node in a network that controls everything from behind closed doors, that has always been the real government, that has been planning the current situation since before anyone alive was born. This projection cannot be falsified because it is not really about Freemasonry. It is about the need to believe that the forces shaping the world are controlled by someone, that there is an agent behind the impersonality of historical change, that the disorientation of living in a complex and unpredictable world is the result of a plan rather than the absence of one. What all of these projections share is that they are more revealing about the people doing the projecting than about the thing being projected onto. The lodge is, in this reading, a kind of historical Rorschach test. Each era looks at it and sees its own preoccupations reflected back. The conspiracy theorist sees a conspiracy. The Enlightenment philosopher sees reason and brotherhood. The church sees a rival. The totalitarian sees an enemy. The civic optimist sees the best version of American democracy. The excluded see the hypocrisy of institutions that claim to represent values they deny and practice. None of these readings is entirely wrong. The lodge has been, at various points and in various places, a space for Enlightenment philosophy, a rival to the church, incompatible with totalitarianism, an expression of American civic idealism, and a vehicle for exclusion. The readings are wrong only when they treat the part as the whole. The whole is considerably more complicated. It is an organization that has lasted 300 years in its modern form. It has lasted not because of any single thing it is, but because of the flexibility of what it offers. The ritual structure, the symbolic vocabulary, the organization around degrees of initiation. These are containers. What gets put in them varies by time and place, and the specific needs of the people who gather around them. At its best, the lodge has been a space where men who found something missing in the rest of their lives came together and found a version of it. The missing thing has been described by different people in different eras as brotherhood, as philosophical fellowship, as civic community, as ritual experience, as the practice of facing death with companions. These descriptions are not all the same thing, but they point at something real, a human need for organized community around shared commitment that is not quite met by the family, the church, the workplace, or the state, and that the lodge has served, imperfectly and partially, for people who could find no better alternative. At its worst, the lodge has been a network of private loyalty that protected its members at the expense of public accountability, that excluded the majority of humanity from its stated ideals, and that allowed men to congratulate themselves on their commitment to brotherhood while practicing something considerably more limited. The worst version and the best version are not contradictions. They are the same institution in different circumstances, with different people, at different moments in the same long history. The question worth asking, as this account reaches its end, is not whether Freemasonry has been good or bad for the world. That question is too simple for the answer the evidence requires. The question worth asking is, what 3 centuries of misreading, both the flattering misreading from inside and the hostile misreading from outside, have obscured? What they have obscured is the actual human story. The men, and eventually the women, who found in the lodge something that mattered to them, who took an oath in a room with a checkered floor and felt that the oath was real and the room was significant, who called strangers brother and meant it, within the specific limits of what that word could mean for them, in their time and their place and their social world, who kept the ritual going through periods when it was dangerous and through longer periods when it was simply unfashionable, because the thing it offered was worth the cost of keeping it. These people are not the heroes of a grand narrative about the secret architects of civilization. They are not the villains of a conspiracy theory about the hidden government of the world. They are men and women who needed something specific that the rest of their lives was not providing, who found a particular institution that offered a version of it, and who participated in that institution with the mixture of genuine commitment and ordinary human limitation that characterizes participation in any institution that asks more than convenience from its members. The George Washington Masonic National Memorial stands on its hill above the Potomac, built to look like something ancient even though it is less than a century old. The Pharos at Alexandria, the lighthouse it was modeled on, stood for 1,500 years and then fell in an earthquake. What it left behind was not the structure but the idea that it is possible to build something intended to last, to orient travelers, to mark a place as significant, even knowing that everything built eventually falls. The lodge has been trying to be that lighthouse for 300 years. It has guided some people and misled others. It has illuminated certain things and cast shadows over certain others. It has been claimed by those who wanted to use its light for purposes it was never designed to serve, and it has endured those claims by being, in the end, something simpler and more durable than any of them. It is a room. It has a ritual. It has people in it who have promised to treat each other as brothers. That is not the whole truth about Freemasonry. It is not the most exciting truth. It does not explain the dollar bill, or the disappearance of William Morgan, or the suppression of the lodges under Hitler. But it is the truth that has kept the lights on in those rooms for 300 years, while every grand explanation for what the lights meant has eventually gone dark. The room is still there. The meeting is still happening. The men inside it are still, in their various and imperfect ways, trying to be what they promised to be when they first walked through the door. History has rarely been kind to institutions that claimed more than they could deliver. Freemasonry has claimed a great deal. It has delivered something more modest, more durable, and in the end more human than the claims suggested. 300 years is a long time for a set of ideas that started in 4 London taverns. It is an even longer time for a mystery that was never quite as mysterious as everyone needed it to be.